Hello. Yeah, that's dumb. Greetings. This is Jago Hinete making a reaction video about Lesson 1 and Lesson 2 in the subject of microprocessor and microcontroller. Lesson 1. What are microprocessors and microcontrollers? Based on the Google result, a microprocessor is a type of miniature electronic device that contains the arithmetic, logic, and control circuitry necessary to perform the functions of a digital computer central processing unit. A microcontroller is a small computer on a single metal oxide semiconductor integrated circuit chip. Of course, they have their components. There's the CPU, an I/O, a bus, both memories, a timer, interrupt, serial port, and parallel port. In this case, the CPU for computers, it has no RAM, no ROM, and no I/O. The reason for that is because we have physical RAM, which is here. And this RAM is dead, by the way. A physical ROM, I think it's still kicking. And an I/O, input output, which is located right here on this motherboard. Moving on to, there are examples of CPU for computers. There are the Intel I series, the AMD A series, and the Ryzen series here. Now, moving on to microcontrollers. A microcontroller is basically a single chip computer. And examples, there are the Motorola 6811, Intel 8051, the Zilog Z8, and the PIC 16X. I actually have examples for it. Here is the, for both the microcontroller and the microprocessor. This is an Intel 3, an Intel, I think it's a 3, and it's also dead. And the example for the microcontroller is this little tiny dude here, and it's dead too. Okay, and obviously there are differences between the two, which you can see in this image. Pause it or take a screenshot if you want. Lesson 2. Evolution of microprocessors. Now this is about the history of Intel microprocessors. The first ever was Intel 4004. Year of introduction was 1971, way back in the 70s. It was a 4-bit microprocessor compared to our, 64-bit, 32 bits. And next is we have a 4 kilobyte memory. Imagine that. That's too small for now, for this day standard, right? It has 45 instructions and it uses the technology of PMOS. It was used mainly on calculators. Next iteration is the Intel 8008 in the following year, which is 1972. It's upgraded into 8-bit version. It's an upgraded version of 4004, and it has 16 kilobytes of memory, 48 instructions. They added 3 more instructions there, and it still uses the PMOS technology. Next iteration is the Intel 8080. In the following year, again, 1973, it's still an 8-bit, but 64 kilobyte main memory. 2 microseconds clock cycle time, much higher clock speed. 500,000 instructions per second. Imagine that. In 1971 and 1972, it only has 45 and 48 instructions. And in 1973, it was upgraded to 500,000 instructions per second. Imagine that. It's 10 times faster than the 8008, and it uses the NMOS technology. Next iteration is the Intel 8085, which is made after 2 years of the 8080. Still an 8-bit microprocessor, and it's also just an upgraded version of the 8080. Still have 64 kilobyte main memory, 1.3 microsecond clock cycle time, much faster. It has 246 instructions, and a little fact, Intel sold 100 million copies of this 8-bit microprocessor. That's a lot of money. Uses only 1 plus 5 volts power supply. And from here on, it's just upgrades and upgrades and upgrades and upgrades and upgrades. Now, though, so it's just from the Intel 4004 to Intel 80486. It's just upgrade, 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 upgrade until we get to the Pentium series. It was first released in 1993. Sorry about that. It's a 32-bit microprocessor with a 64-bit data bus and a 32-bit address bus. It has 4 gigs of main memory, double clocked 120 and 133 megahertz version. Imagine how slow that is in today's standard. We have like 3 to 5 to 7 gigahertz of CPUs. It also has a faster version and it's 233 megahertz. Next is the Pentium Pro. Released on 1995, still 32-bit microprocessor, 64 gigs of main memory. Now, that's a clear upgrade. The Pentium 2, 1997, 32-bit microprocessor, 64 gig main memory. It's much faster now. Pentium 3, 32-bit microprocessor, 64 gig main memory, dual independent bus. Upgrades. Pentium 4, released in 2002, which is 18 years ago. Imagine that. Still the same. And it's made for streaming videos, game, and DVD applications now. Pentium 4 was revolutionary. Excuse my language. Revolutionary, because it allowed you to stream videos in much smoother rate. It can game, and DVD applications when you want to, watch something. And that's it. That's the history. But the latest iteration of the Intel processors are the Intel Xeon, which is a server chip, and the Intel 9900K, which is incredibly fast and incredibly expensive. But still worth it if you have the money. Moving on to the applications of microprocessors. Now, based on what I researched, we are practically using microprocessors at all times. Example, our phones. Another example is the traffic light control, communication equipment, television, satellite communication, home appliances, microwave oven, washing machines, gaming devices. It's all there. We're still using it until this day, and probably 100 years in the future, we are still using microprocessors. Let's move on to the 32-bit, the difference between 32-bit and the 64-bit. Moving on to 32-bit processors and 64-bit processors, their differences. Now, a big difference between 32-bit and 64-bit is the number of calculations per second they can perform. which affects the speed at which they can complete tasks and such. Computing. 64-bit processors come in dual core, quad core, 6 core, and 8 core versions for, home computing, gaming, multitasking, basically. Multiple cores allow for an increased number of calculations per second that can be performed, which increases the processing power and helps make a computer run faster. That's why when you say quad core, sextuple core, octa core, that's much faster when you compare it to dual cores and such as that. And another big difference between 32-bit and 64-bit processors is the maximum amount of memory that is supported. 32-bit computers support a maximum of 4 gigs of memory, whereas 64-bit CPUs can address a theoretical maximum of 18 EB. My god, that's a lot. However, the practical limit for 64-bit computer is just 8 TB of addressable RAM, and that's much. And I think that brings us to our conclusion. Thank you very much for listening, and whatever. Don't subscribe to me. I don't have a channel.